Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are digging into the absolute firestorm at the St George Illawarra Dragons. We're going to go way beyond the headlines to really understand the anatomy of how a club could collapse this spectacularly.
And then the official news dropped. And wow, it was a bombshell. Not just the head coach, Kyle Flanagan, but the general manager of football, Ben Haran, were both gone. A total clean sweep at the top.
Now, this all came after a staggering 11 consecutive losses. A losing streak like that for a club this proud, it just wasn't sustainable. So you have to ask, how did it really get this bad? And who's actually responsible? All right, let's get into it.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the crisis itself. Then, we'll put the key people on trial, so to speak. We'll dig into who's really to blame, expose the internal politics tearing the club apart, and finally, try to figure out what on earth happens next for the Dragons.
Right, let's start with the situation on the ground. You know, this wasn't some snap decision made after one bad game. No, this was the boiling point of a club that had been in a deep, spiraling crisis for months.
And the irony here, it is just brutal. Kyle Flanagan gets a brand new contract extension right after the team's last win in 2025. He never coached a single game under that new deal, not one. Before you know it, he's out the door.
I mean, even the journalists who cover this stuff for a living were completely stunned. It's just peak rugby league chaos, isn't it? To show that much public faith in your coach, only to have the whole thing completely implode before that new contract even kicks in.
So this is the really critical question. Why did Flanagan actually leave? Because the club, well, they told one story, but the commentators and the insiders, they painted a very, very different picture.
So on one hand, you have the official line, it was mutual, we were worried about his health, a compassionate decision, right? But on the other hand, the word on the street is that he's a fighter who would never quit. The reality is he'd lost the dressing room, his message wasn't landing, and the situation was just getting worse. He really had no other choice.
Look, sacking the coach is always the easiest move, right? It's the most public thing a club can do to show they're making changes. But as anyone who follows the game knows, the rot in a crisis this deep goes way, way beyond just one man with a clipboard.
And that's the key question, isn't it? A team doesn't lose 11 games straight just because of one person. It points to a total system failure. And the first place you have to look is at the players out on the field.
A core group of highly paid, senior players have been getting called out for just not showing up. We're talking million-dollar star players looking disinterested, guys getting suspended for ill discipline after they've already said they're leaving. It's a mess. You've got players who are absolute world beaters 1 minute and then completely disappear the next.
And this quote from Andrew Voss just nails it, doesn't it? He says they have the most unreliable group of players he can remember. So the talent might be there on paper, but week in, week out, you just had no idea what you were going to get.
Okay, so if the players are underperforming and the coach has lost control, what about the people who hired all of them? What kind of responsibility does the board have to wear for this mess?
Rugby league legend Gus Gould, well, he doesn't mince his words. He says, when you sack a coach, it's not the coach that's failed, it's the club that's failed. And he's right. The board made that premature call to re-sign Flanagan. They signed off on the roster. Ultimately, the buck stops with them.
Now, to make all of this even more complicated, you have to understand that the Dragons aren't just one unified club. They're a joint venture. Basically, two old proud clubs, St George and Illawarra, smashed together. And that means two power bases, two boards, and some deep divisions that affect every single major decision. And if you want to see this power struggle in action, look no further than the debate over the interim coach, Dean Young. The St George side of the board loves him. He's a club legend, one of their own. But the Illawarra side, not so much. They're worried it looks like nepotism, since his dad is a legend there too. He's become a political football between the two factions.
So what you have is this constant state of internal friction. It impacts everything. Who they hire as coach, who they recruit, the long-term strategy, everything. It creates this foundation of instability that makes it almost impossible to build consistent success.
So, the coach is gone, the players are under the microscope, and the front office is basically at war with itself. The path forward? Man, it is anything but clear. Where do the Dragons possibly go from here?
And if you're a Dragons fan looking for a quick fix, well, experts like Gus Gould have some pretty brutal news. He thinks this is a 5-year cleanout and a 10-year turnaround. This is a long, painful rebuild, and it's going to require a whole lot of patience.
The search for a new coach is already on, of course. You've got a few names in the mix. Ben Hornby,
Another club legend who learned from the master, Wayne Bennett. You've got a guy like Brad Arthur, who has experience with tough, ground-up rebuilds. And then there's Dean Young, the interim coach who knows the system, but, he also represents those political divisions they need to get past.
And really, that brings us to the final critical question, doesn't it? The Dragons got rid of the coach, but the underperforming players are still there. The divided board is still there. The deep-seated cultural problems are all still there. It leaves this profound, almost impossible challenge for whoever is brave enough to take this job on.